They said the Spitfires looked fragile when they first saw them, skimming just above the channel, their wings so thin they seemed more like dragonflies than weapons. On a good day, with the sun low and the sea almost silver, the German crews joked that these British fighters were toys, the last desperate trick of an island that didn't understand it had already lost. That was before the wreckage began to fall back across occupied France, twisted bombers scattered in beet fields and orchards, oil staining the soil, crews missing from the mess tables, chairs left empty at briefings. By the autumn of 1940, the jokes had stopped, and the same pilots who had laughed at those toys found themselves flying into a sky that felt like a trap built from radios, discipline, and the stubborn will of tired men in small, fast planes. The night before it truly sank in, London burned again. Sirens had screamed their now familiar rising wail. People had gone down into the underground with blankets and gas masks, and a stream of bombers had rumbled overhead like a distant, rolling storm. In the suburbs, the windows rattled first. Then a dull thud came crawling through the air, a pressure you felt more in your chest than in your ears. Anti-aircraft guns had opened up, tracer fire clawing for the black shapes above the orange smear of the fires. By dawn, the smell was everywhere. Wet brick dust, smoke, and that metallic tang that clung to the back of the throat after an explosion. And in a field just beyond the city, still beaded with dew, the charred skeleton of a Heinkel bomber lay broken in two, its wings snapped and its engines half buried in the soil. Crows hopped about the wreck with total indifference. Above it all, almost lazily, a single Spitfire banked in the early light and headed back toward its airfield, engine humming steadily as if it had simply finished some routine chore. 3 months earlier, on a warm evening in occupied France, the mood around a Luftwaffe dispersal hut was very different. The airfield lay just inland from the coast, where the sea breeze brought a faint salty smell and cooled the concrete. The Messerschmitts and bombers, Heinkels and Dorniers, rested under camouflage netting, their silhouettes visible beneath the mottled fabric like sleeping beasts. Inside the hut, under a yellowish light, pilots crowded round a map of southern England spread over a table. Crews pointed at Portsmouth, Dover, London, tobacco smoke curling above their heads. "They have nothing left," one bomber pilot said, tapping the map with a gloved finger. "After France, after Norway, those little fighters of theirs, what do they call them? Spitfire, Hurricane, pfft." He made a dismissive gesture, as if flicking ash from a cigarette. Pretty names for toy planes. The laughter was easy, confident, the sort shared by men who had already beaten 3 air forces and watched panzer columns punch through countries in weeks. Someone imitated the elegant elliptical wings of a Spitfire with his hands, wobbling them like a child's model. Another pilot joked that the RAF pilots probably wore silk scarves and sipped tea in the air. In the corner, Oberleutnant Karl Weiss listened and smiled politely, though he kept his own counsel. He had flown over Dunkirk and seen the chaos on the beaches, the lines of ships stretching to the horizon. He had also seen British fighters that did not behave like toys, darting in and out of his formation, clipping off bombers from the edges like wolves worrying a herd. Later that night, in a briefing room that smelled of chalk dust, sweat, and coffee grown cold, Hermann Göring stood before senior officers and let the full weight of his confidence fill the space. He wore his white uniform that evening, a deliberate choice. The decorations on his chest glinted under the overhead lights. Behind him, on the wall, hung maps of the British Isles, scored with red arrows and yellow grease pencil notes. "England," he declared, his voice swelling with theatrical indignation, "is not a problem. Britain is an island that has lost its army and will soon lose its hope. With the Luftwaffe," he paused, letting the word hang in the air like a banner, "we will break their resistance. We will blast their ports, their ships, their factories. We will sweep their little fighter force from the sky. Their government will see the truth. It will be over." An officer ventured a question about the Royal Navy, about the risks of crossing the Channel, about weather and tides. Göring waved it aside with a fleshy hand, rings catching the light. The Luftwaffe would clear the way, he said. The RAF would be broken in days, weeks at most. Their fighters are outnumbered. Their industry is small, he insisted. Once we smash their airfields, those Spitfires and Hurricanes will have nowhere to land. They will burn on the ground or fall into the sea. The words sank in. The Luftwaffe had been promised something like a final act of the European campaign. One more blow, decisive and unstoppable. In that room, with its sharp smell of ink and cigarette smoke, the British defenders were reduced to symbols. Small red circles for airfields, lines of blue squares that supposedly represented squadrons, dots, and arrows. Easy to rub out out with a cloth. Across the channel, those red circles on the maps had names and smells and sounds. One of them was Biggin Hill, an airfield nestled among the gentle, rolling hills of Kent. On a July morning in 1940, Pilot Officer Edward "Eddie" Collins leaned on the wing root of his Spitfire and felt the metal still slightly warm from the test run. The aircraft smelled of fuel and oil, and under that, faintly, of canvas and leather, a mix that had become, to him, the scent of the war. Ground crew moved around him with practiced speed. One checked tire pressures, another refilled ammunition drums with belts of 303 rounds that clinked softly as they fed into the wing. Over by the dispersal hut, a dog slept in a patch of sun, unconcerned by the world's crisis. The wind bent the grass and brought with it distant hints of the sea and, on some days, smoke from bombed ports. Eddie's parachute harness dug into his shoulders as he shifted his weight. He was 20 years old, and already older than he felt he had any right to be. The chalk cliffs lay somewhere to the south, out of sight. Beyond them was France, and beyond that, everything they were supposed to be holding back. Inside the operations room, the air was cooler and tasted of dust and hot equipment. On one wall, a large table map of southeast England lay under glass, covered with small colored blocks and arrows that moved in response to shouted instructions from women in blue uniforms. These were the plotters, members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, hands steady as they reached out with croupier-style rods to push markers representing formations of aircraft. The markers had tiny tags, numbers, headings, altitudes. Above the table, the sector controller watched intently, a telephone pressed to his ear, listening to the voices coming in from the radar stations and filter rooms. Terse, measured, carrying hints of strain. On another wall, a blackboard showed squadron states: readiness, available, refueling, rearming, scramble. Chalk dust floated in the sunlight, slanting through the high windows. The fans ticked and hummed. Under it all, like a heartbeat, was the constant murmur of radio static and distant voices over the loudspeakers, coded calls and altitude reports blending into a thin, metallic background noise. What the Luftwaffe's leaders mocked and dismissed as toy planes were, in reality, only one visible piece of a much larger machine. Over the eastern and southern coasts, tall steel towers rose like strange skeletal giants, chain-home radar stations. They loomed above fields and cliffs, their girders humming in the wind. At their bases, in low buildings that smelled faintly of wet concrete and ozone, operators sat with headphones clamped to their ears, watching trembling lines on green glowing screens. When the German formations began to gather above their French airfields, those lines twitched and grew. Men and women wrote numbers on grease pencils, passed them to runners, who carried them to filter rooms where the data from many stations merged into a coherent picture. From there, they were relayed to the sector stations like Biggin Hill. On paper, Britain had far fewer fighters than Germany. In reality, the radar chain and the system behind it multiplied every squadron. Aircraft did not have to patrol aimlessly, burning fuel in fruitless circles. Instead, fighter command could wait until the peaks on the cathode ray tubes began to climb, and then send up just enough Spitfires and Hurricanes to meet the incoming raid. It was as if the RAF could see through the clouds and the darkness of the channel and choose its moments, conserving strength while the Luftwaffe blundered forward along rigid flight plans. In July, the pattern of the battle began to take shape. Eddie's life shrank to a series of routines broken by terror. Mornings often began with a mug of tea gone lukewarm while he sat in a deck chair outside the dispersal hut, Mae West life jacket already on, waiting. The smell of cut grass mingled with that of petrol and cigarette smoke. Somewhere nearby, someone would be reading a newspaper, trying to ignore the headlines about shipping losses and political speeches. The sky above Kent was often a perfect blue, with high clouds drifting lazily, innocent of the danger they would soon host. Then the phone in the hut would ring, and the tension in the room would rise like a silent tide. A corporal would answer, listen, and then call out the words that tightened every stomach. Squadron scramble! Squadron scramble! Chairs flew back, mugs were abandoned, tea sloshing onto the ground. Boots thudded across the turf as pilots sprinted to their aircraft, parachute straps flapping against their thighs. Engines coughed into life, shuddered, then roared as throttles opened. The air filled with the tang of aviation fuel and exhaust. Propellers spun into gray discs. One by one, the Spitfires lifted off the grass, wheels tucking in as they climbed toward the distant dots that represented the incoming raid. From the ground, the battle was a distant spectacle. Thin white contrails scratching the blue, flashes of sunlight on wings, tiny puffs where shells burst. From Eddie's cockpit, the world was a vibrating bubble of noise and color. The engine's roar filled his bones. The canopy smelled faintly of warm plexiglass fiberglass, rubber, and sweat. The harness held him tight as the aircraft bucked in turbulence. The other Spitfires in his section were silver-green shapes off his wings, their pilots invisible behind mirrored goggles. Bandits. 12 o'clock high. Angels 15, came the calm voice of the controller in his earphones. Angels 15, 15,000 feet. Somewhere ahead, beyond the sun's glare, dozens of black specks moved in formation. At first, they seemed to hang motionless. Then they grew, resolved into 3-engine bombers with escorting fighters above and to the side. Eddie could see the fat bellies of the Heinkels, their glazed noses, the tiny dots that were gun positions. Above them, angular Messerschmitts prowled. Steady, Red Section, his flight leader's voice said. Wait for it. Wait! The RAF's fighters were outnumbered, but they almost never attacked blindly. They were vectored in from the ground, placed where they could slash into the bombers from above or the sides, strike hard, and then dive away. It was always a race against time and altitude. Reach the raiders before they released their bomb loads. Hit them hard enough to break up their formations, but not linger so long that the escorts could swarm them. When the order came, break! Eddie pushed the stick forward, and the Spitfire leapt, nose dropping as gravity and engine worked together. The air screamed along the wings. The bombers' silhouettes grew rapidly, and he saw for a brief instant the white face of a German gunner behind his glass dome, head turning, mouth open in a shouted warning he could not hear. Tracer bullets snaked up toward him, red-orange beads floating in straight lines that only looked slow. He squeezed the trigger, and the wings vibrated as 8 machine guns spat their invisible stream. The nose of one Heinkel blossomed with sudden flame and smoke. It banked sharply, the formation behind it shuddering as pilots tried to avoid collision. He smashed through their altitude, pulled hard until his vision shrank to a gray tunnel, and his chest felt like it had a sandbag on it. Above him, Messerschmitts dove, their yellow noses flashing. The sky was suddenly full of planes going every which way, the neat German formations blown apart into individual machines trying to kill each other. In the increasing chaos, the Luftwaffe's earlier sense of superiority began to fray. These were supposed to be weak defenders swept from the air. Instead, they were fast, aggressive fighters appearing in exactly the right place at exactly the wrong moment. Back in France, the mood at Karl Weiss's base shifted with each passing week. The first days had been filled with confident chatter about imminent victory, newsreel teams visiting to film bold Luftwaffe crews before their historic missions. Now, there were empty bunks. The mess hall fell quieter, conversations broken by sudden silences when someone mentioned a name and realized there was no answer. The airfield itself acquired a new smell, burnt oil and hot metal from aircraft that returned damaged, wings ragged, fuselages peppered with holes. Ground crew worked longer hours, hands blackened with oil and aluminium dust, patching up bombers that looked like sieves. The question no one wanted to voice aloud hung over many evening gatherings. Why were they still encountering British fighters, and in such numbers? The German intelligence estimates had promised the RAF would be exhausted quickly, yet raid after raid reported interception. Fighters appeared over the channel, over the coast, deep inland. They were not just random flights. They attacked with uncanny timing, often catching bomber formations when they were most vulnerable, climbing, turning onto their headings, or returning home low on fuel. Some in the Luftwaffe speculated about secret British airfields hidden in woods, or reserves of aircraft they hadn't counted, or perhaps American volunteers flying in disguise. Others quietly wondered about those strange tall towers they had seen on the British coast, the ones they had occasionally been ordered to bomb but which seemed oddly resilient. The attacks on them had achieved little. Even when buildings at the base were hit, the networks of wires and the steel skeletons remained standing, and, after a short interruption, the British fighters kept arriving on cue. Meanwhile, in the darkened rooms of Fighter Command, chalk dust and sweat built a different picture. The commanders knew how close they were to the edge. Replacement pilots came in with fewer training hours than the men they replaced. Some had never fired their guns at a moving target before entering combat. Aircraft production strained to keep up with losses. Factories hammered day and night. By late August, the RAF had lost hundreds of fighters and many experienced officers. Airfields were cratered, hangars shredded, runways pocked with bomb holes. Yet the system held barely, like a rope frayed to a few strands. Eddie felt that strain in his bones. He flew multiple sorties per day, sometimes barely landing before being sent back up. Sleep became a patchwork thing, grabbed in chairs, on camp beds, wherever he could fold, boots still on. His ears rang constantly from the engine noise and the crack of guns. His right shoulder throbbed from the recoil of the control column in tight turns. The smell of cordite and exhaust clung to his flight suit. At night, when he shut his eyes, he saw tracer lines and the slow, tumbling fall of stricken aircraft, friend and foe alike. Then the Luftwaffe changed tactics. Frustrated by the resilience of Fighter Command, they turned increasingly to bombing cities, especially London. It was supposed to be the final breaking blow. Set the capital on fire, crush civilian morale, force the British government to the table. On the ground, this meant that the pattern of days became became marked by the glow of nights. People in the East End learned to read the sound of engines, to distinguish the throbbing approach of a bomber's stream from the sharper note of a fighter. Fire crews grew hollow-eyed. Children slept in stations with dust drifting down from the tunnel roofs whenever a near miss shook the surface. The shift to the Blitz brought new horrors, but it also granted fighter command an unexpected reprieve. With the Luftwaffe less focused on systematically destroying airfields and radar stations, the RAF's infrastructure had room to breathe. Chain Home continued to operate. Sector stations, though damaged, remained functional. The battered system had a chance to repair itself, patch holes, rotate leaders, and bring in new squadrons, including hardened pilots from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other countries that had already fallen. One afternoon in September, the Luftwaffe mounted one of its largest efforts yet. The air over northern France throbbed with activity as formation after formation took off, climbing through layers of cloud. Karl's bomber group joined the stream, engines laboring as they hauled full bomb loads. The channel lay below, a dull strip of metal gray under patchy sunlight. On the radios, voices crackled in clipped German, call signs and headings exchanged as units formed into their assigned routes. Inside Karl's cockpit, the air smelled of oil, leather, and the faintly acidic tang of nervous sweat. His hands rested lightly on the controls as the bomber settled into its cruising altitude. Beside him, his navigator hunched over charts, pencil moving rapidly. The intercom carried the murmur of the crew, the occasional cough, a muttered comment. Out ahead, the leading formations were dark shapes, their exhaust trailing like smudged lines on the sky. Above them, he could just make out the weaving forms of fighters. "This will do it," the navigator said quietly after a few minutes, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the fragile confidence. London can't take this every day. Karl didn't answer immediately. He was thinking of the last raid, of the sudden violence with which Spitfires had plunged into his formation, of the way one bomber had simply vanished in a blossom of black smoke and orange flame, leaving only a hole in the line. "Maybe," he said at last, "if we get through." Over Kent. Operators at the radar stations watched the blips on their screens grow thicker. Teleprinters chattered. In the filter room, a wall map of the channel filled with colored counters as reports flowed in, each one a fragment of some distant reality. A height, a bearing, a rough number. WAF plotters pushed the counters forward, updating them with swift hands. A senior officer watched the pattern coalesce into something unmistakable. A major effort, aimed straight at London. Phones rang in rapid succession at sector stations. At Biggin Hill's operations room, the order was crisp and urgent. Every available squadron to readiness, then to the air. The blackboard filled with scrambled notations. In the dispersal hut, Eddie and his fellow pilots dropped everything and ran, hearts thudding. The day was deceptively beautiful. High visibility, scattered clouds, the sort of sky that would have been perfect for a lazy Sunday flight in peacetime. Instead, the air was thick with a sense of imminent collision. Climbing out, Eddie saw other squadrons lifting off from nearby fields, Hurricanes rising from grass strips, Spitfires banking and slotting into formation. The channel glimmered in the distance. Above it, faint but growing, were the dark threads of contrails that marked the German approach. Controllers on the ground began vectoring them in, voices calm but quick. "Red section, turn to 080. Climb to Angels 20. Keep your eyes peeled, boys. There's a lot coming your way." The first contact was almost always visual, a faint smudge, then a cluster of dots. As they closed, the details emerged, rows of bombers, their formations tight, with the more agile fighters weaving around them like shepherd dogs. The sound reached them as a deep, far-off hum, rising slowly in pitch as distance closed. There was something primitive about that sound, as if some enormous machine were grinding its way forward. "Here they come," someone breathed over the radio. This time, the sky itself seemed to rebel. Hurricanes charged straight for the bombers, targeting the mass, willing to trade shots with the gunners if it meant shattering the German formation. Spitfires darted for the escorts, trying to keep the Messerschmitts too busy to protect their charges. The air filled with intersecting trails and flashes. Eddie chased a Bf-109 that had dropped low to pounce on a climbing Hurricane, his own aircraft shuddering as he pushed it to the edge. The German plane twisted away, its pilot skilled. For a few seconds, they spiraled around each other, each trying to get the other into their sights. Sunlight strobed across Eddie's eyes as the world rotated. He pulled a little harder, felt the wings complain, and for a moment, the Messerschmitt slipped into the circle of his gun sight. He fired a burst. The German fighter jerked, smoke streaming from its engine. It rolled over and fell, the pilot ejecting the canopy and bailing out, the parachute blossoming like a sudden white flower against the blue. Eddie did not watch it all the way down. There was no time. Another call, another threat, another vector from the controller. For Karl, the turning point came not as a single dramatic event, but as a gradual, appalling realization. As his formation neared the English coast, British fighters appeared, just as they had before, but this time, there seemed to be more of them, and they came in well-coordinated waves. First, a high squadron sliced into the formation, forcing bombers to break and weave. Then, as the gunners tried to adjust, another group came in from below, rising through the pack. The neat rows fell apart, radios filled with shouted warnings and calls for help. Somewhere to his right, a bomber took a direct hit, its wings separated in a clean, impossible line, and the aircraft flipped over, falling in a trail of debris. Close up! Close up! Carl shouted into the intercom, even as he knew that it was a near impossible order. The bomb run itself became a nightmare of evasive action, flak bursts, and sudden glimpses of fire streaking past the windows. When they finally reached the release point, London sprawled beneath in a patchwork of smoke and sunlight. Bombs fell, yes, but many of them were released late, early, or not at all, as crews struggled to keep control. The way back was worse. British fighters harried them over the city, over the countryside, even as they limped back toward the channel. The escorting Messerschmitts, short on fuel due to their limited range, began to peel away. Some did not, some stayed too long, and only realized their mistake when their fuel gauges sank toward empty, while the gray line of the French coast was still uncomfortably far. On that day, and on others like it, the Luftwaffe left a trail of broken machines in the Channel and along the fields of southern England, a jagged scar across the map marking the place where confidence met reality. Back at the bases in France, the debriefings grew harsher. Staff officers started to admit, in cautious tones, that losses were unsustainable. Experienced crews were gone, replaced by men who lacked their instinct and their ability to survive chaotic engagement. Flight leaders who had once plotted neat geometrical bombing runs now found themselves improvising routes that zigzagged to avoid heavy concentrations of flak and fighters, reducing accuracy. Göring raged. There had to be a reason, a failure somewhere, faulty tactics, timid escorts, perhaps even cowardice. It couldn't be that the entire premise had been flawed, that the toy planes had never been toys, and that the British system as a whole had been misjudged from the start. In England, the mood was grim, but it contained something else, a stubborn, growing belief that the impossible might just be possible. The newspapers still showed photographs of destroyed homes, people standing beside the rubble of their lives with dazed expressions. Funeral processions wound along streets lined with blackened buildings. Looters were arrested. Firemen slept where they fell. Yet above the headlines, sometimes in small print, were the claims of enemy aircraft destroyed, the tallies chalked onto mess boards. Today, 20. Yesterday, 40. Whether or not they were accurate, they gave shape to a feeling. The attackers were paying heavily. In the mess at Biggin Hill, Eddie sometimes stared at the board listing probables and destroyeds, and tried to match them to faces and machines he had actually seen fall. The tea was always too strong, the bread sometimes stale, butter ration. They joked morbidly about their own chances, about buying it or catching a packet. New pilots arrived, their uniforms stiff, their eyes hungry for approval. Older ones, if they could be called old at 23 or 24, looked at them with something like pity. On one evening late in the official period of the battle, Eddie stepped out of the hut and felt the cool air on his face. Somewhere in the distance, the remnants of a raid burned, turning the horizon a dull orange. Above it, for the first time in a long while, the stars were clear and steady. A Spitfire sat nearby, its paint scuffed, exhaust stains streaked along its fuselage, like an overworked horse resting between rides. He reached out and ran a hand along the smooth metal of its wing, feeling the chill under his fingertips. They thought you were a toy. He murmured to the machine, half amused, half appalled at the arrogance of someone who had never sat in that cockpit, had never felt the engine's vibration through the seat, or the moment when the aircraft seemed to become an extension of his own body. A toy. It was like calling a scalpel a spoon. The official end of the Battle of Britain would later be marked in dates and tables. 10th July to 31st October 1940. Losses counted in columns. Victory assigned in concise phrases. The Luftwaffe failed to achieve air superiority. The planned invasion of Britain was postponed, then quietly shelved. In Berlin, attention shifted eastward, toward the vastness of the Soviet Union. Strategists and historians would argue for decades about whether the Germans might have succeeded if they had pressed harder, or altered their tactics, or persisted in attacking the radar chain and airfields. They would weigh tonnages of bombs dropped against aircraft shot down, sortie rates against production curves. For those who had lived it from inside the noise and the smoke, the answer felt simpler. The Luftwaffe had flown into a battle it believed was primarily about numbers and courage, about the raw performance of aircraft. They thought the rest of it, radar, command systems, logistics, was secondary, an afterthought. They mocked the RAF's fighters as toys, because they were small and pretty, and because contempt was easier than respect. But war, especially air war, was increasingly about invisible threads, radio waves, information, timing. Britain's fragile, improvised network of towers, plotters, controllers, and pilots had woven those threads into something that could catch even an experienced experienced adversary. Karl Weiss survived the battle, though not without scars. On one mission, his bomber limped home with a wounded engine belching smoke, barely clearing the French coast before he had to crash land in a field. The impact smashed his nose against the instrument panel, leaving a scar that ran from above his eyebrow to his cheek. In the hospital, he lay among other aircrew, some with bandaged eyes, others with arms in slings, listening to the sound of ambulances coming and going outside. The word among the nurses was that operations over England had been reduced, that more attention was being paid now to other fronts. Officially, the line was that they had taught the British a lesson, that London had been punished, that the enemy would think carefully before defying the Reich again. Years later, in a quiet, civilian life, he would sit in a small garden in a reunified Germany, the air filled with birdsong instead of the drone of engines, and he would read accounts of the battle written by historians who had access to archives, documents, and both sides' perspectives. He would learn about how the radar stations he had flown past in puzzlement had given his enemy precious minutes of warning, how the plotting tables had allowed them to put fighters where they were needed without wasting fuel, how the supposedly thin Spitfires had been robust enough to absorb punishment and agile enough to outturn his escorts. He would remember the jokes in the ready rooms, the easy contempt for British machines, and feel something complex, shame perhaps, mixed with professional respect. Eddie, if he lived through the war, carried different memories. The smell of damp sandbags in a slit trench while bombs fell nearby. The peculiar stillness inside a cockpit at high altitude, above the clouds, where the world below looked almost peaceful. The constant cycle of fear, exhaustion, relief, and grief. The faces of friends lost not only to enemy fire but to simple miscalculation, mechanical failure, bad luck. The sound of Churchill's speech crackling over a mess hall radio, the phrase about the few, echoed in toasts and jokes in the years afterwards. For him, the battle was not a neat victory, but a long, narrow escape from disaster. The Blitz did not stop when the official Battle of Britain ended. It carried on. More nights of sirens and fires, of civilians huddling in basements and tunnels, of searchlights combing the sky like pale fingers. But something fundamental had shifted. The Germans had not broken fighter command. The sky over England, though contested, was not dominated by the swastika-marked wings that had ruled elsewhere. An invasion fleet never sailed. German troops never poured across the beaches of southern England under cover of a total, crushing air umbrella. The island remained a thorn in Hitler's side, a base from which future operations would be launched. In the end, the story of that summer and autumn might be told simply as the story of an arrogance that cracked. On one side, a vast, confident air arm, high on recent victories, convinced it could batter an enemy into submission from above, sure that a smaller, weaker foe would break quickly. On the other, an improvised system cobbled together in peacetime by men who had seen another war and sworn not to be caught unprepared again, staffed in wartime by young pilots and tired plotters who clung to their posts even as bombs fell nearby. Between them, high above the Channel and the fields of Kent, fast, beautiful machines tangled and fell. The names of those machines, Spitfire, Hurricane, Heinkel, Messerschmitt, became part of the war's language. Yet beneath the legends and the silhouettes and the paintings of dogfights was a simple truth. The Luftwaffe mocked the defenders of Britain and paid dearly for it. The Blitz, meant to shatter the island's will, found itself breaking first on the thin wings of aircraft that had been dismissed as toys, and on the invisible net of radio waves and human resolve that held them aloft and guided them into the path of the invader.